There's a lot of websites that show you what is a median LSAT score for the schools that you're interested in. Same thing with GPA. And generally speaking, LSAT is more important than your GPA. But there are also a lot of soft factors that can contribute to your application. So like if you're a first generation student, socioeconomic factors, race and ethnicity, obviously the caveat is that SFFA happened, which basically said that schools can no longer collect uncontextualized race data. So what that means is basically if you want to talk about your race, you have to contextualize it in kind of an essay or an addendum. So like for me, for example, I would say I'm Latina, and that contributed to me wanting to be the first Latina lawyer in my family, and kind of why that's important to me and my professional career. Okay, work experience, leadership, community service, all really important. Again, I also took 3.5 years off between undergrad and law school, so I had a lot of work experience. And I definitely wrote about that in my personal statement. And recommendation letters can also help in the soft factor aspect. Okay, more decision factors, timing. Most admissions are rolling, so you should apply early. The earlier, the better, because you're competing against less people. Obviously, there are more spots. The more you wait, the less spots, obviously, and it's more competitive. So generally, you should try to apply by Halloween time, is usually the sweet spot. There are also early decision schools, so not every school does this, but it helps to apply early decision if you're close to the GPA and LSAT medians, and then you should look into scholarship considerations for early decision. So commonly, if you applied earlier decision, it just said that you really wanted to go to that school. So you would technically have less scholarship opportunities, but not always. Every school is different. I see some questions coming in, so maybe I'll stop and answer those. Okay, so the first question is, do schools account for undocumented students who probably aren't able to get internships or gain as much work experience? I don't know if they would specifically account for that, but I think if you could explain, obviously what the situation is and why you couldn't get typical work experience, I'm sure you have a ton of experience if you're undocumented, and in different ways. So I would talk about that rather than comparing yourself to other students, if that makes sense. Okay, on average, or from what you have seen, how long lengthwise are essays, addendums, statements, etc. Every school, I would say, has their own requirements. Like they'll tell you in the application. They're usually released on September 1st. So you can, on September 1st, kind of take a look at what the application would look like. But typically, a personal statement was 2 pages when I was applying. I think that's probably still true. Obviously, before the Supreme Court decision in Students for Fair Admissions, I had diversity statements. So that was also a page. I don't think diversity statements are collected anymore.
No. So I think also I want to add to the first point where the length of the essays. So most schools, they have like their own like limits. I think usually it's like a page or two. However, I do also want to encourage folks to like not think that that's like the like how everyone should do it. Like, I think most people say that like if you can keep it more concise, more brief, it's even more appreciated. So not just because the limit says like, for example, like 500 words or like, 750 words, like that's how many you should do. It's up to that much, right? So yeah, if you can just keep it concise, I think that might even look even better. But again, also just keep in mind that like you want to make sure that you share what you want to share in the most concise and appropriate way possible. So keep that in mind too. And then the around the other point, what was the other point again? It was around, do you remember, Isidora?
The first question you mean, or
It was like the second question around
work experience?
essays, but if not, we
Oh,
can always go back.
Yeah. Um, Sorry, I forgot the first point too. Was it diversity statements? Is that what we were talking about?
Yes. Okay. Yeah. So it's around diversity statements. So again, as we know, in 2023, there was a Supreme Court decision that ruled off like admissions decisions to be made on a race basis. So I think what a lot of schools are doing now is they're kind of reframing that question in a different way. Before it used to be called diversity statements, but now most schools are kind of framing them as like personal experience statements or adversity statements. So moments when you had adversity. So also just keep that in mind. I think it's almost like their way to kind of go around the Supreme Court decision and to still get a sense of like where you're at, what kind of experiences you've had in the past that kind of led you to your decision to be like, I want to go to law school.
Yeah. And Anthony said the same thing. So thank you both in the chat. Um, and the other question here was if scores are lower than median, is it still best to apply ED? I'm assuming you mean both scores, so you're like LSAT and GPA. I would say I was well below median for both at Columbia, and I didn't apply ED because I wanted to see, what schools would give me scholarships, and I wasn't 100% sold on Columbia at that point. Um, so I didn't apply ED because I just wasn't completely set on Columbia. Um, but if you really know that you want to go to a school, um, maybe ED is the right decision for you. You just kind of have to figure out what the scholarship situation looks like. Is that right, Jesus?
Yes.
Okay. Oh, also one more thing on the diversity statement and personal statements. I know like as undocumented students, it's kind of difficult to differentiate between the two. So what I did was I talked about being undocumented and having undocumented family members in both, but I did them in different lenses. So my personal statement was kind of about my career goals and kind of, because I was undocumented, I had to work, became a paralegal, I'm still undocumented, want to be an undocumented lawyer. My diversity statement was kind of how being undocumented affected me personally, and kind of what life experiences I would bring to the classroom. So it was the same thing, but two different lenses. So I think that's a helpful way to think about it if you're struggling to differentiate. Okay, LSAT, my least favorite subject. No, I'm kidding, but I did struggle with the LSAT. So the LSAT is the law school admissions test. It's four sections, three of them are scored. There is logical reasoning, analytical reasoning, and reading comprehension. As of August of this past year, or this year, um, logic games are replaced with an additional logical reasoning section, so no more logic games. So if you have like an old book, don't don't spend your time on logic games. There's an unscored writing section, which is argumentative writing. That's unscored, like I said. So you have to do it and you have to do a decent job. Um, but I wouldn't worry too much about the writing score. Okay. Um, a low LSAT can be offset through a high GPA, strong resume, and essays. Um, it determines the scholarship amount significantly for most schools. And then you can retake the LSAT if needed. I think I took it 3 times, which I think might be the limit now, actually. Um, but I think there's a limit on how many times you can take the LSAT, at least from what I remember. Right? I would
I
double
think
check.
rather than thinking of like if there's a limit, I think you should also like review the school that you're planning on applying to and to see like what kind of their policy is of just the scores that you submit. There are some schools that they take like an average of the scores, your LSAT scores. So that's also important to keep in mind, like, would it be worth taking it again and potentially scoring lower or potentially scoring higher? Maybe it'll increase the average. However, there are other schools that they could also potentially um, I think most schools, in my experience that I've reviewed, they take your highest score. So also just keep that in mind. So just think of like the risk or the cost that it would take. But I think if anything, if for you all to walk away with is definitely to just investigate, right? Like what schools are you interested in and what are their kind of the rules that they have for like for the LSAT and whether it makes sense to take the LSAT again.
Yeah, it's also quite an expensive test. It's not cheap unless you get a fee waiver from LSAC, which I think everybody should apply to. I didn't get one because I was also working as a paralegal. So, I mean, hopefully the LSAT is what you pay for, and then the law school application itself is not what you pay for through a fee waiver individually through the school. Um, but when you're thinking about your law school application, the LSAT and like your standardized test of your choice should be the most important priority. There's also a new program called JD Next, and I didn't know about this until I was reviewing for this presentation, but it sounds really cool. It's done through Aspen Publishing, which is the company that sells most of our textbooks in law school. It's an 8-week virtual part-time, approximately 6 hours per week course on law school skills with a test at the end. I think it's interesting because unlike the LSAT, it's like a real course of like legal classes. And it would substitute the LSAT or the GRE. 57 schools participate so far, and our advice is that you check in with the schools participating in this program and determine how they evaluate JD Next applicants versus LSAT GRE applicants. But sounds cool. I wish I would have taken it. Okay. Should I pause? Are there any questions?
So we did have a question around does school ranking matter? So I think this might be a question for folks that are even just like in the beginning stages of like seeing like what schools they want to apply to. Yeah, like I guess in your experience, Isidora, maybe like when you were applying to schools, did that matter? And now that you're already like almost finishing up your schooling, like has that mattered at all?
I think it matters um, for what you want to do. So, like, if your goal was to go into, a corporate law firm, if you have the work authorization to do that, then I would say, yeah, probably the ranking does matter. But in New York, at least, you can practice law without work authorization. So a lot of my undocumented friends would go to maybe a lower ranked school that has, more money to give out. Um, And then I think at that point, probably your ranking doesn't matter because if they want to do something in public interest, they could find a job doing that and they wouldn't necessarily go to like a corporate law firm. I think for me personally, like I knew that I wanted to try at least. For me, like being in New York was more important than going to like a cheaper school, if that makes sense, just because my entire family's here and I felt like I needed to be here in case there was an emergency. So I kind of just like tried to get into Columbia and then it worked. And now I'm going to a corporate law firm after graduation. So does ranking matter? Yeah, I guess if that was always your goal, but I think for me, being in New York was most important. I don't know if that answers the question, but it's so personal. It's like such a personal decision. And there were people at my corporate law firm who also went to lower ranked schools but did incredibly well. Whereas like if you go to like a Columbia or like an NYU, you could kind of just skate by. Not that that's the goal, but it's possible.
Also, we have someone that just shared their experience of why they want to go into law, and it's so inspiring. And yeah, just really want to appreciate everyone for just being so accepting in the chat and also for being so comfortable and also sharing your story. So, huge shout out to that individual. And I don't want to say their name out loud since this is a recording, but just really want to appreciate them for sharing their story and being so vulnerable to a group of, strangers. So, just really appreciate you. And it's also a testament of our community.
Yeah, congratulations. That's amazing. Also, what an incredible reason to want to go to law school. Okay. Maybe this is a good segue for to talk about personal statements and essays. Um, I really love what you did with this slide, Jesus. Write without fear and edit without mercy. I think that's the perfect way to do this. Okay. So personal statements are usually required in law school admissions. Prompts are generally school specific. So at least like when I was applying for college, we had like one common app for all the schools that I wanted to go to. And that common app was kind of sent out to all the public schools in New York. Um, so make sure to keep track of each school's prompts. Generally answer, why am I going to law school in your head, and then sit down to write that. A good place to discuss immigration narrative, but not necessary if you're uncomfortable with that. You can also discuss your race and ethnicity. Again, remember to contextualize and start writing early, because I promise that your first draft is going to look incredibly different than the final draft. Okay, I have to move along because I'm taking too long. There are also additional essays, so some are optional and some are required depending on the school. They usually look like one of the following prompts. So why X school? If you're interested in public interest, essays for a specific scholarship, famously NYU, you could apply to so many scholarships and they all require a different personal statement.
Oh my God, it's so funny. Like when I was applying to like this was back in like what, 2019. I got to the NYU application and oh my God, it was just never ending. So that's why it's
Yeah,
so important to like go back to the slide where we talk about like timing, like really like start to picture like what how long it will take you to do these applications because some of these essays they're never ending for a good
like
thing.
yeah, it takes forever. Um, And if you're waitlisted, you should follow up with a letter of continued interest. I could send around some examples of that for the schools that I was waitlisted at, but I think that's also important. Okay. Anything quick on essays? Okay, I don't see anything. Do you see anything, Jesus?
No, not specific to essays. So maybe we can move along.
So I'm going to go to scholarships and loans. Obviously, I think this is the most important for our conversation. Obviously, there aren't that many people who are undocumented and go to law school. Um, so there isn't like a ton of information out there. Scholarships are generally available to all students. I think we go through this later on in the presentation, but at most private law schools, undocumented students are considered international students, but it's different than like going to a public school like a university, um, because you would qualify for different things. So scholarships for undocumented students include merit, need-based, conditional, external private scholarships, and you can always negotiate these scholarships. Loans, obviously, this is another big one for undocumented students. So undocumented students are generally not eligible for federal loans, unfortunately. um, there are small loans in California, but they're not great. They usually don't cover the cost of attendance. And then same thing in New York. There are some DREAM Acts that could affect depending on like where you want to go. Um, I found a private loan provider, which is how I went to law school. They charge an incredible amount of interest rates. So I would do it carefully. And I would consider what your career prospects look like, because my loans will probably never end. In my opinion, that was worth it because I would like to go into corporate law. But there are also other options, and there are probably smarter financial options. So this is something that's really, really important, and it's so personal to every situation and to every applicant. Um, Law school is incredibly expensive. I think it's worth it. Obviously, I'm doing this, but it is incredibly expensive. And
Yes. And financial aid is usually like a point of contention, right? Like for a lot of students, it's usually kind of like the make it or break it. So I think it's really important to also hone in into like your story and think about why is it that you want to pursue like law school or a legal career. And that could potentially land you some good scholarships too. And if not, I think it's also important to also think about your hard factors, as Isidora was sharing a little bit earlier, like your GPA if you're currently in school. What are some ways that you can strengthen that? And then also your LSAT. There are some incredible LSAT instructors or programs that you can do. I know a lot of students that go through our programming that see a tutor that they can help them one-on-one if you need additional support. So yeah, just think about those things too that can also factor into your potentially like landing financial aid as well.
Mhm. I don't know what I did to stop my screen share. That was on me. Um, I might have to just do it this way because I don't want to waste more time chatting. Is that okay, Jesus?
Yes, definitely.
Okay. So, like Jesus was saying, scholarships are so important and personal. I'm always here to talk about kind of like what each different situation could look like. I'm also not an expert. Again, also like incredibly privileged to have DACA. Um, so I would keep that in mind, but kind of happy to help you do research if you're feeling stuck. Okay, where should you apply? Another important question and really personal. Um, Rankings aren't everything. You can receive high quality education at many law schools, regardless of ranking. We kind of discussed this already. Some law schools are regional, public interest focused, private sector focused. A really famous one is CUNY in New York City, kind of known for doing just public interest work, and they're incredibly well respected in the community, even though their ranking isn't the highest. But it doesn't really matter because they're so good at what they do. Um, Attending top ranked law schools helps for certain career, like big law firms and prestigious public interest jobs, but not so much for others. And you should definitely apply to ABA accredited law schools because it's going to be important when you take the bar to have graduated from one. Other considerations for undocumented applicants, factors to consider. Can you take the bar in a state where your school is located? So New York and California for sure. There are definitely a bunch of other states, but in more rural, like red leading states, you should double check that you can take the bar as an undocumented person, even if you don't have work authorization, because you don't need work authorization to practice law, at least in California and New York. Do you have to move to a state where you're allowed to take the bar? And then are there any financial aid restrictions for somebody with our status? Okay.
Yes, and I just also quickly want to mention, since we have folks from all over the US joining us, the like something important to note too is that there are states that prohibit in-state tuition in public law schools too. So also just think about like as you are kind of brainstorming and creating your list of schools that you want to apply to, like would it make sense to go to states that aren't very undocu friendly? So, for example, there are states that prohibit in-state tuition in public law schools like Georgia, Indiana. There are also like states that where even attending a public law school is prohibited. Like there are locked out states like Alabama and South Carolina for undocumented students. So just think about those things too as you start to think about like maybe if you live in Georgia, like would it make sense for you to pursue law school there? Or I know like one of our program participants right now is a student in, well, she lives in Georgia, but she decided to go to law school in New York. So that's just something to think about too.
Yeah.
Where
Also,
would your most support be? Sorry.
and also like a ton of financial aid considerations because obviously you can't live at home with your family if you choose to move, and rent in New York and California is incredibly expensive. So just something to think about.
Yeah, or I mean, there are also some students that are incredibly fortunate and like some of them they get like a full ride scholarship, right? They get like full tuition scholarship. But then there's also cost of a like your cost of living expenses, right? So you also have to think about that too. So yeah, and we can always talk about that later in our panel as well.
Yeah. Um, okay, so immigration status and admissions. I don't mean to be going through this so quickly. I just have a few minutes left. Um, Undocumented students and DACA students are often considered international students, which is kind of what we discussed earlier. This doesn't usually affect scholarship amount, particularly not at private schools. It's quite different than like being an undergrad in a public institution, but it would vary from school to school. And you can disclose status in a personal essay or a personal experience essay. You don't necessarily have to write an additional addendum. Talk to admissions and financial aid officers to get an idea of how responsive they are to the needs of a undocumented student. Sometimes you'd be surprised by how little they know. When I came to Columbia, there were no openly undocumented students, which was a really big shift from my undergrad experience, which had 500 undocumented students at CUNY Hunter. At Columbia, a couple of miles away, there was only two of us in my year. I think now we're up to five, but there are 400 students in every class. So there's only five of us and 1,200 students. So you can imagine that the Office of Financial Aid doesn't really understand us. So, but we have each other. So there's that.
Yes, and I think it also shows like the importance of spaces like this and also like pipeline programs, getting people to law school or just higher institutions in general. Because as someone that works with undocumented students, we see the numbers dwindling of people, undocumented students that are even just applying to like colleges, like four-year institutions. And then that also just like the percentage of those students to go into higher institutions, like law school in this instance is even lower. It's like 2%, right? 3%. So, and yeah, I think you're just an example of that. But yeah, just it shows resiliency. So, and not just in Isidora, but of our panel that will be joining in, and also for everyone here today too, that despite just our political climate and just everything that we have gone through up to this point, we're still pursuing and we're still paving our way for ourselves and for our families and our communities.
Yeah, for sure. Also, why it's really important to stay in contact. So please always feel free to reach out. I'll keep reiterating that because I always love to read personal statements and kind of help bounce ideas off each other. Okay, so if you are applying to law school, you obviously want to set yourself up for success. Doesn't matter how early it is. Uh, if you are currently in school, you should focus on your GPA. Explore new interests. They always make a really interesting personal statement. There's no right way to get involved for law school. You don't have to be a poli-sci major. You don't have to do the pre-law programs. But you really should be thinking about building relationships with your potential letter of rec writers. And you can apply for the Immigrant Rising pre-law program, which I found incredibly helpful. And you should keep track of all of your experiences, even if they're not typical work experiences. Our lives are so different compared to our peers. So I think everything matters. Okay, 5 minutes, right? Okay. I'm such a yapper. I'm like, I could just talk forever. Okay, so next steps, review our resources, plan ahead. You should figure out if you want to take the LSAT, the GMAT. There are pros and cons to all of them. You should make a database of schools that you want to apply to, including deadlines, essays, and scholarships. You should ask for letter of recommendations early. And what will take the most time is to edit your essays because it's a very involved experience, kind of traumatic in some ways because you have to recount your entire life story and figure out what's actually important for law school, even though we know all of it's important. Okay, and finally, reflection questions. Is law school right for me? Is it worth my time, energy, and money? Why do I want to go to law school? And think about future options. What future employment options are available to you given your immigration status, i.e. work authorization, and the current political climate that we're in. Yeah, obviously more important now than ever to have undocumented lawyers, but you also have to protect your peace. Okay, questions? We
All
went
right.
through
So
so
I'm
much.
looking at Thank you, Sidora. And yeah, I think this was incredibly helpful. And I'm looking at the Q&A section too. So are there LSAT prep programs or books you recommend?
Yes, Test Masters is really great. That's what I used. Um, I got a scholarship through Manhattan Prep, which I found really helpful. But it's incredibly expensive and very involved. So if you don't have like a ton of time to dedicate in a day to one thing, I would probably choose Seven Sage or um, Test Masters if they're still around.
Yes,
But
I've
I
heard
would,
so many good things about Seven Sage too. So
yeah, no, it's really great. It's also really great if you're like in a time crunch. I would avoid Kaplan and Princeton, my personal experience. They're not usually taught by um, people who have taken the LSAT, so that's just one thing to keep in mind. Obviously, if that's your only option, it's better than nothing. Um, but yeah, if there's like a specific
yeah.
test company, like always ask around. Um,
And then for folks that are also interested in taking, for example, like the GRE, that's also an option for law school. And I recommend Magoosh. It's like cheaper than most programs, most like prep programs out there. And I think it's like 100 and something for like 6 months or something like that. So I recommend it, and it's mostly like do it at your own pace. So this is mostly for students that like have like a busy schedule, or for like working professionals. So people that are thinking of going back to school, I highly recommend that. Or for folks like a GRE like could also be a good option for folks that are interested in like doing like a joint degree program, right? Like you're not just interested in like going to law school, but you're also open to other graduate programs too.
for
So
sure.
keep that in mind. And then let's see, other questions. So more around the fee waiver. I know that that's also a big question around like the fee waiver and like people that are just asking about eligibility. I did share a link earlier in the chat, just what eligibility. There's like citizenship requirements, which is ridiculous, right? But I mean, these are the people like if I could be in charge of that, I would change that. But again, so some of the requirements is that you have to be a US citizen. And then for folks that are undocumented, or for folks that are not from the US, they do say that like you have to be like applying for asylum, or for folks that have kind of like a pending case. Um, and then for folks with DACA, unfortunately, folks that are fully undocumented won't be eligible for the fee waiver as of now. But again, that doesn't mean that like there aren't programs out there that could support you. Like for example, we have our pipeline program, our pre-law program that also covers the fees of like a LSAT. So just also keep that in mind. We provide $2,500 for 10 individuals that go through our program. And for folks that like are accepted to the program, they're given that money, and they can use that money for their application fee expenses. And the LSAT obviously could be one of them too. So keep that in mind, that like even though you're not eligible for the fee waiver, you could kind of find ways to pay for it through other programs and support systems.
Yeah, and also just to reiterate the point about asking for fee waivers from individual schools, because obviously there's when you apply through CAS, so you apply for like the LSAC fee, but you also apply the school like direct application fee, and that's basically to pay the people who are reading your application. Those can be really expensive and they vary by school. So like for Columbia, for example, I emailed Columbia directly and was like, "Hey, this is really expensive. Can I have a fee waiver?" And they kind of give it out like candy. Like I never got told no, at least for New York schools.
Yeah, yeah, I think just ask because aside from paying for the LSAT, you also have to pay to report it, and you also have to pay um like per school, like how like to report your score per school, and then also for the application fee waiver, right? Like the I think a lot of students, they could definitely email the schools and say, "Hey, can I get a fee waiver?" for your application too. So there's definitely ways to go around it. And again, I encourage it's if this is sounding like gibberish for a lot of you, which I totally understand, I'll be sharing again the link to our law school resource guide for undocumented students, and that is like super detailed. I think it's like 50 pages long, and it kind of guides you through the process of like all these questions you guys are having and how to go about it. So I'll put it in again, but in the meantime, maybe we can answer one more question and then we'll go into our panel. And we can always just address some of these questions again with our panel. All right, so maybe the other question, do you want to choose the question, Isadora, if you can see them?
I only see the more recent ones. So I see that Janet asked, how much time does it take to study for the LSAT? And how long does it take for one to feel ready? Um, I would say it took me like a good 6 months. Probably I studied for longer than that, but I wouldn't recommend that because I started to make mistakes and I started to like really absorb those mistakes. And then it was really hard to shake after 6 months. So again, I was under the median for Columbia. So I think I probably could have done better if I had like put in a little bit more effort. But I was working and I had other responsibilities. So I would say like probably 6 months
And I
at
think
least.
something too that I encourage applicants to do is if you know what your weak points are in your application, like for example, if you feel like maybe your LSAT isn't as strong, like address it in your addendum and say, hey, I acknowledge that this isn't as strong. But these are the things that I'm doing right now to make me a more qualified applicant. So something that I tell students, it's like if you want to take something in the meantime, maybe there are programs that are like pre-law school programs that kind of prepare you for the academics of law school. You can also say like, hey, I'm taking a course through like maybe UCLA Extension, UC Berkeley Extension. I know there's like courses they offer there too that can kind of make you a little bit more like to show that you're interested in their school and that you're finding ways to improve yourself, especially for like GPA, right? Like if you got kind of like really like a really low GPA, that's something that you can't control. So you know, it's done, it happened, but you can also find ways to kind of make your application look a little bit more competitive too.
Yeah, for sure. I don't want to take up too much time, so I'll let you head into the panel. But one last thing is I'll share my email again in case anybody has any questions or needs to chat about law school admissions. So it was so good to see you, Jesus.
Likewise, Isadora, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll stay in touch. But yeah, right now we're going to transition over to our panel, and I couldn't be more excited to just introduce these three individuals that are doing amazing in their own spaces. And yeah, just really excited to have you all here today. And it's also really exciting because all three of you are like in different parts of the country too. So we have folks in like the state of Washington, in Wisconsin, and in California, if I'm correct. I'm also in California. Uh, but yeah, we're gonna have a space for just introductions. So I want to just briefly introduce the three of you, and I will start with Noor. So Noor, pronounced she, her, immigrated to the United States in 2001 from Palestine. She graduated from Eastern Connecticut State University with a degree in political science and is working on going to law school. She currently works as a paralegal at the American Civil Liberties Union, or ACLU, of Wisconsin. And now I will transition over to Jesus. So Jesus, pronouns he, him, is a DACA recipient from Tijuana, Baja California, Mexico, and is currently a third-year law student at Harvard Law School. Jesus grew up in San Bernardino, California, and he received his bachelor's degree from the University of Southern California. And we also have Marta Flores. So Marta Flores, pronouns she, her, is a first year student at Seattle University. She comes from a mixed Mexican and Salvadorian background. She loves dancing and reading Baroque literature. Moreover, she enjoys the wet climate of the Pacific Northwest. Oh, I'm so jealous. Where she lives with her beautiful babies. So yeah, welcome to the three of you, and it's just really nice to see such a like diverse and like wholesome panel as well. So hopefully we can get a lot of different perspectives around your journeys and your experiences as well. So I actually wanted to start with a question for all of you, which is how has your experience as an undocumented student shaped your perspective on law and justice? And whoever's ready can start.
I can start. Hi. So I think in terms, sorry, my phone keeps going off. If you hear it being my apologies. I think it's given me a lot of empathy and understanding the different aspects of the law and how, like I was talking to a mentor of mine and he said, and I walked in there feeling really sad and realizing that and reading all the cases and realizing that fairness or equity is not really part of justice. And so he said, well, justice is just us, right? And it was said by a white heterosexual man. And so and it gave me a lot of, it took me a minute to think, oh my goodness, there's a lot to that there's gonna be against certain people, but it just makes me think that in a way with intersectionality, we all have something that we're even for people who carry different types of privileges, right? Everybody has something that they're carrying. And I think empathy is one thing that in this country is losing a lot of. And I think every day when I look at myself in the mirror, when I see my children, when I go out, I think of like, okay, I feel like I'm in the right path. So that's how my positionality reminds me of not just me, but those around me.
Mm. Thank you, Marta. Jesus, do you want to share as also someone that's in law school too?
Yeah, sure. So I think so first of all, I'm really excited to be talking to all of you guys. For me, I think it's manifested itself in every facet of my life. I think that this resonates with everyone here, but just feeling like I didn't have autonomy to do the things that I wanted to do, or I didn't have as many avenues open to me, or just couldn't figure out how I would make my dreams come true. I think I became motivated to want to change something in that aspect. And I think this goes not only to like application cycles, but also to like my philosophy on what I want to do and in the law. So I want to focus on immigration law, and the way that I think about it is all it takes is one. So when I think about applying to law school, I think all it takes is one person to recognize your worth, one person to recognize that, you're going to be a phenomenal student. And I think the same goes for the law. Like when I think about my story and the way that I grew up, I think about all it takes is one. Like whoever that one person was who pushed for DACA, whoever that one person was who filled out my application, whoever, that one person was that believed in me when no one else did. I think that has really shifted my view in the law because I think, yeah, maybe something that might take me 5 minutes to fill out for someone's immigration paperwork will only take me 5 minutes, but to them, like it might change their entire livelihood. And so I think I'm just really excited about being able to contribute to this panel, but also to the legal field.
Noor.
Thanks, Jesus. I'm also very excited to be here tonight. Thank you for inviting me and excited to talk to all of you. I would echo a lot of what the other Jesus said. I think for me, being an undocumented person and student has completely shifted the way that I think about law and justice and how I want to move forward. I'm someone who has always known I was undocumented, right? It wasn't a surprise to me, but I don't think I really understood what it meant in practice until I started looking at education. And so when for me personally, I received a $20,000 tuition bill to go to school 3 weeks before I was supposed to head off to college. And finding out that the reason for that is because some governor decided that because I'm undocumented, I deserve to pay an outrageous amount of money to go to
Mhm.
college. It shifts your perspective a lot, right? We are people who are directly impacted in the system every single day. And I'm someone with DACA, so every day I'm anxiously waiting for the next court decision. But we're also getting a new president soon, right? And whatever happens there is going to continue to impact our lives. So for me, it feels kind of wrong to call it a justice system. Right now, it feels like an injustice system. And to know that it was kind of built to ensure that people like us fail um, motivates me to continue moving forward and breaking down those barriers. And I don't know that I would have that same experience had I not been undocumented. Um, so I encourage you all to also keep pushing forward despite how hard it looks right now.
Definitely. Oh my God, I got chills, but it's definitely true. And I think that's also why it's so important to have more people like us in those spaces, to really just question these laws, right? Because as Marta was kind of saying earlier, a lot of these laws were written by old white cisgendered like heterosexual men, right? So just think about that. And um, yeah, so I think it's also important to just look at these laws and challenge them. So yeah, appreciate the three of you for sharing that. And now I'll go into the next question, which is what specific challenges have you faced in your legal education so far? Or for some of you that are out of school, like what challenges have you faced in just like even just employment right now and just getting like experience in the workforce? And how have you overcome them? So maybe I can start with maybe Noor. And maybe you can share a little bit about like your experience as a paralegal and yeah,
Yeah.
how has it been like even just getting some of that experience too for you?
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of the legal education part of this, so I graduated college in 2021 and I've been trying to go to law school ever since. And so I think that that kind of shares the kind of challenges that I'm personally facing. Um, first, as I kind of heard earlier from Isadora, that LSAT is a struggle, right? Finding resources to study for the LSAT, how to apply to law school, how to write a good essay. That's really hard for people who are first generation. Whether you're a first gen law student or first gen college student, there are a lot of challenges. And for me specifically, one of the hardest ones has been funding a law school education.
Mm.
Um, I did have a really good scholarship offer last year, but I couldn't find a way to fund living expenses. And that's something that's really important to consider. I'm super privileged to have DACA, so I have a full-time job, but I'm also a main financial provider in my family. And so having to think about how that's going to look when I go to law school, kind of taking out one person's finances and having to navigate that has been really difficult. And I'm from a locked out state. So even if I went to a state school here, I would have to pay an outrageous amount for tuition, just like in my undergrad. So that's been difficult, but something that's kind of helped is the experience that I'm getting now. And you don't have to get legal experience. I think for me, it's just something that I'm passionate about and I do want to do. I work at the ACLU, so we do civil rights work. I didn't start as a paralegal. I moved up to that position, but it is really great because it helps you find out if being in the legal field is for you. So even if you're still in college or still really early on in your education, like reach out to a lawyer and see if you can shadow them or talk to them over coffee. A lot of them are willing to do that, but law school is a really big step. It's a personal step, it's an expensive step, and I highly encourage you to try to get some experience in the legal field just to figure out if that's something that you could see yourself doing as a long-term career. Because even if you get a scholarship, there are other expenses and time to consider. And so for me, it has shown me that I still want to be a lawyer. So I have not been scared away from the field yet, but I do highly recommend at least shadowing an attorney and just kind of getting a feel for what the rest of your life is going to look like.
Yes, getting that experience even in like a legal like setting too. Like a lot of people don't realize that like law is a lot of paperwork.
It is.
I also used to be a paralegal and oh my God, like
Yeah.
yeah, you have to do so much paperwork.
It is not like Suits
Yeah,
in
it's
my
not cute.
experience.
Yeah. So yeah, just also being realistic of what that looks like. And it's not just like how to get away with murder or suits. But now you mentioned financial aid, and I know we have like two current students here. So I'm also kind of curious, like, how are you paying for law schools too?
I
So
think I definitely resonated with a lot, if not everything that Nor said. I also graduated in 2021, and the biggest kind of hindrance in my ability to want to go to law school or even consider it was how do I pay for it? I'm sure that if you're already looking into applying, you've seen that it's quite difficult to secure financing. Um, but I think before I go into that, I want to explain something a little bit about my own cycle. So I thought that I would go straight through, and I was pretty convinced that that's what was going to happen. I severely underperformed on the LSAT. That test is daunting, and I hate it. So that cycle, I ended up applying, and I ended up getting over 20 or 30 rejections, and it was completely demoralizing, and it was it was pretty sad. But I think that people like us are used to getting told no, and that only motivates us even more. And so what that meant for me was that I was going to try again. And so the very next cycle, I applied again. And the day that I got into Harvard, it was my first acceptance, and I was on 12 wait lists, and I got my 13th wait list that same day. And I just remember they kept saying, um, I know you guys have all these different options for schools, and I'm sure that you're considering them all heavily, but in my head, like there wasn't really a choice. Um, and so going back to the financial aid part, I think that it's still something that really scares me. I'm on loans, I'm on private loans, and because I'm considered an international student, that means that, the interest rates are absurd. Um, and in my head, I feel privileged enough. Like I feel humbled every single day when I get to go to school and I get to say, like, never in a million years could I have ever imagined that I'd be in the position that I'm in. But it also reinforces the idea that like whatever happens is gonna happen. And I think it's difficult to try and limit my life based on all these possibilities of what could happen. And so to the extent that it's possible, I think that it's important to try and like live our lives as best we can. And then we're all highly adaptable. So when things change, I think we'll all be able to roll with the punches. I'm also feeling the elections, and I'm sure that it's going to affect us in some way. But I think we've gotten this far. We were never supposed to get here, and here we are. And I think yeah, I think whatever happens, whatever your goal is, wherever you're headed, I think that as long as you stay, convicted in your idea of what it is you want, I think you'll make it happen.
yes. And just a reminder that like the system is not built for us. And that's why I'm like, we're gonna go into like our fifth year of the pre-law program. And something that I keep telling people and like supporters or people that are interested in the program is that it's not a linear path for undocumented students. Usually people think that like, oh, after you attend like undergrad, for example, you go straight to like law school or grad school, right? For most of us, it's not like that. We have to take breaks, or sometimes even if you do decide to go straight, you have to go again because yeah, there's just it's not the same. So thank you for sharing that, Jesus. And now I want to hear from Marta.
Yeah, I was really down after the election on Tuesday, and some people may feel that way, other ones may feel the opposite, and I've been feeling down since then, but I'm really happy I joined this call because just hearing Noor and Jesus, and I can't see all the other people that are logged in, but I just, you guys make me feel so much better. So thank you all for joining, and especially for the panelists for sharing your story. And to answer your question, Jesus, um, I'm gonna admit to this. I never admitted to anybody, but I am an elder millennial. So we were like one of the people who were marching in DC to get DACA, and like, so my journey is quite a bit different than Noor and Jesus, right? I did all my undergrad having to pay out of pocket, and which is maybe the case for still a lot of folks, and I understand it's hard, but you get it done, and every day you wake up and you go through it every day. Um so for me, having had that journey, I think it gives me, much like Jesus is saying, like, I'm like, if I, in the event I don't have the money to pay for a semester, I'm gonna go on leave. Like, I have a plan for this, right? I'm gonna go on leave, work, and then come back. So for me, for me, it's like time will pass, but I'm still working towards it. So that's how I cannot take time off to focus on on all day law school traditionally. So I am actually doing a flex program, and so my classes are in the evening online. So after this, I'm gonna go to my class, my legal writing class, and so I made that choice because I know I have to have a full-time job, and I'm also a single parent. So I have to be really dedicated and very structured and organized as to how I divvy up my time. So for example, there's burners I have turned off. Like, my social life is zero, right? And in my bed, but I have to keep things going, like my children and my work and law school now. But in terms of how I'm paying for it, I'm getting my family to support me to pay, because I make enough money to pay to support me and my children. But for like my sister's pitching in, my mom's pitching in for my birthday, I tell people, don't give me presents. Here's the jar, put money in there. Or like for my children's birthdays, I said the same thing. Pitch in, help me out. Um, and so far I haven't tapped into any loans. I am ready to tap into equity in my house if I have to, but like for me, it's like whatever it takes, right? And so it's really hard because when I'm not doing good in the class, I'm like, oh snaps, I'm paying so much money for this to not be doing well. It really hurts my heart and my pocket. So that's how I am. I'm asking for a lot of help. I'm filling out scholarships. I'm not getting most of the scholarships, but at least I'm trying. So that's how I'm getting by.
Yes. And y'all are getting by, but also like there are people that are kind of witnessing your path, your journey, and whether you might not notice or whether you do notice, there are people watching you and they're getting inspired by your journeys. Yeah, so and like for me, like being a paralegal too, like when I was a paralegal, nobody even saw me like doing that work, and it's hard work, right? It's just you're like stuck in an office, right? So just also hearing those stories too, even as a fellow paralegal, like it's inspiring to see other people with like your experience in that too. So it's beautiful. So now I want to ask a question to Jesus. So Jesus, Harvard Law has a strong focus on social justice and advocacy. Can you discuss any particular projects or clinics you are involved with that relate to immigration law or undocumented rights, since you did share that you're also interested in going to immigration professionally as well?
Yeah, so Harvard actually has two different clinics, and one of which is called like the Harvard Immigration and Refugee Clinic, which helps with a lot of asylum cases and other sort of like memo writing kinds of things that get sent up to the court. And they also have what's called like their crimmigration clinic, which is the intersection of immigration law and criminal law. So while at Harvard, I've had the opportunity to attend bond hearings or parole hearings. I've gotten to go to the detention centers to conduct intakes, or evaluations about people's possibilities for some kind of relief, which has been really rewarding. There's also like less non-committal organizations such as like the Harvard Immigration Project, which gives the opportunity to just put on different events that give people a touch of reality, because a lot of people don't really have a sense of what day-to-day immigration looks like. And so last year I was the president of that club, and I got the opportunity to select speakers that would come to the school and talk about their different experiences and what immigration looks like in various aspects of the field, whether that be advocacy or perhaps like actual lawyering for someone and whatnot. Um, and even more recently, I'm not, I think I was more so closed off about my immigration status just because of the ramifications that I thought that it could have on my life. But I now recognize the amount of privilege that I have having attended the institutions that I have and the kind of power that my narrative can yield. And so I've really been proactive about trying to expand doing things like this, so that I could help other students with their college applications or law school applications. So to anyone on this call, feel free to reach out, and I am more than happy to help. But to that point, like the immigration clinics and all the immigration advocates at Harvard have been really proactive about helping me in whatever way I need. And so that's a little bit difficult because it's on me to figure out what it means, like how to carve out exactly what I want so that I could then ask for help and have them help me. So, yeah, I don't know. Immigration, just generally beautiful thing, beautiful people, a lot of support.
Do you know any other undocumented students at your schools?
I do not. I do not, but I don't think that that's because there isn't any. I think that's just because it's hard to connect with each other because a lot of us don't talk about it. And so I think my efforts in talking about my experience has led to me really expanding my community. So now my community is a lot larger than it was a year ago. Like it's grown significantly. And I think there is now a 1L, a first year law student at the school who's also on DACA. And I I now know some other students at other different law schools across the country that are also in different programs. So I think, and actually, I will say one thing. So the one thing was that when I was doing all this and I was trying to expand my narrative, I was speaking to the admissions team at Harvard, and they said that the reason that they don't admit more students like you and me is because more students like you and me don't apply. And to that end, I will say that I came nowhere near the LSAT, nowhere near the GPA median, and I think that it's important to also focus on all the other things that you can provide. So for me, I didn't have any internships when I was in college. I didn't have any jobs that were professional when I was in college. I didn't have any of that. I spent my summers working in warehouses, restaurants, retail stores, and like I was able to explain how these different experiences, perhaps didn't prepare me for a law school education, but they did prepare me to work as hard as I needed to ensure that I would succeed at their law school.
Yes. Thank you. Yes. And I see a lot of nods and people applauding on the chat. So yeah, who knows? Maybe you could also consider a career in public speaking. Thank you, Jesus. So now I will ask Marta a question. So Seattle has a unique legal landscape regarding immigration and undocumented individuals.
Mm-hmm.
How has this influenced your studies and aspirations?
Um, I mean, to be quite frankly honest, and I know this is being recorded, but had I had more options, this wouldn't have it would not have been my first choice. I think Seattle is a very white city. You are I mean, you're undocumented, and then you're the only one of the few people of color. It feels very lonely. And on top of that, there are racist people in these classes. I'm just gonna be honest with you guys. And you kind of feel like the what do you call it the the elephant in the room sometimes because they're talking about you when they're talking about their hate for immigrants or how they think oh undocumented immigrants should be like put in jail. It's painful, it's hurtful, and you kind of just have to take a break and just say what I've learned in my career is to never take anything personal, right? But when they're talking so much directly about you, it kind of hurts. So you have to learn to develop a tough skin, and I'm sorry to say this because we should be over this, but it's not. So I'll just say is that I probably wouldn't have said like to here, but this is where I am. Um, and I actually am not going into immigration. I think for me, because it's a very emotional, and I don't think I have those emotional skills to handle it. So I actually am going to go. So I applaud Jesus for going into that. We need people like you, Jesus. But I actually am deciding to go into environmental law. I think this is another field that I think also needs voices, and so that's where I am headed towards. But in terms of immigration, it doesn't have. I don't think Seattle is known for a hub for the immigration. I think they're known for like maybe IP because of all our tech companies here, intellectual property. Um, what else are they known for? Um, that's pretty much all I can think of in terms of IP. I know my university has a lot of clubs. I joined the environmental one, and then they paid for me to go this like to the environmental law conference to the American Bar Association. That was an amazing experience. I met so many awesome people there. And also another very lonely field where there isn't a lot of people of color. So just know that the law itself, I think for many Latin American origin people, I think it's like at 5% or 8%, especially very low. So for women and minority groups. So just build what I'm learning now. I have to build a group of allies around me, people who are gonna be batting for me, who are gonna know my work. So that's what I'm coming to realization, and it's hard for me because I'm not a networking. I'm not a public speaker like Jesus is. Both of Jesus are great public speakers, but it's putting me in my in my discomfort zone a lot, and but I think that's precisely what's going to make me grow. So I'm learning different soft and hard skills these next 3 years and a half, but I think it's worth the effort.
Yes. Yes. Thank you for sharing that, Marta, and also for sharing like just being very real of like what it's like. And I think that also just really emphasizes like why we need people like us in those spaces to bring in a different perspective and hopefully change in those classes, hopefully someone can have some awareness based on what you share, and they can change their perspective on that too. So yeah, just really appreciative of that. And so now for Noor, I have a question for you. So what inspired you to become a paralegal, and how has being undocumented influenced your career path?
Yeah, so when I was in college, my senior year, I was an intern at the Innocence Project. And I just did intake, so, very basic entering case information. And I worked with a paralegal. And, she said to me, if you want to know what it's like to be a lawyer, then you should learn to be a paralegal. And I'm not really sure that I believed it at the time, but um, I did want, to get that experience. And so I didn't start out as a paralegal. I started out as an intake coordinator at the ACLU, but then became a paralegal. And it is extremely true. I, write briefs, I write filings, I file things in court. Like, I feel like I am the lawyer. I'm just not signing my name on the paper. And like Jesus said, a lot of times people don't see the work that you're doing in the background, but I think that it's really prepared me for being a lawyer. I'm not sure that it's prepared me for law school because I've heard that that's a whole different thing that you're doing. But being undocumented, how has that? I mean, I'm very privileged to have DACA, so it's hard for me to say that has like influenced my career path. Unless you're talking like influenced me to be a lawyer, then absolutely. I've spent, a lot of my childhood in immigration court because my family, was caught by immigration just a few years after I came here. So that I think that played an extreme role in my wanting to be not only a paralegal, but a lawyer later. Um, but that's kind of why I wanted to be a paralegal. I once I kind of found out how big of a challenge going to law school was, I wanted to make sure that I saw myself being a lawyer